Hello and welcome to this special edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu, coming to you from my home just outside Washington, D.C. With COVID-19 changing the way we broadcast, this is part of our new reality. In the United States, the latest government figures show another 3 million people are unemployed, bringing the estimated total to more than 33 million over the past 7 weeks. The European Union is now forecasting the worst economic outlook since the Great Depression, while China's exports unexpectedly rose in April as imports declined. But as the economic and human impact of the pandemic becomes clearer, there are hopeful signs as countries begin to slowly reopen. There's much to talk about. Let's get straight to our panel. Frank Sesno joins us from Washington, D.C. He's the director of George Washington University School of Media and Public Affairs. With us from Beijing is Qinduo Xu. He's a senior fellow at the Pangoal Institution and the host of CGTN's Dialogue Weekend. And Liang heads the economics department at Willamette University in Portland, Oregon. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Liang, let me start with you. If we look around the world, we see that economies throughout the world have been battered, developing countries as well. We look at the European Union, the economies there have contracted by more than 7%. And we look here in the United States, we've just had the latest jobless numbers come out. It now stands at over 33 million. Do you think we've reached the peak as far as the number of jobless is concerned, or is that going to get even higher?
Thanks for having me. I think this number looks like it's still on the go. It's still on the climbing. I'm not too sanguine about the claim that we're reaching sort of the tip. And right now we're estimating about 16% of unemployment rate. And if you remember, most of the economists earlier have estimated the unemployment rate could reach as high as 20% or 32% as the highest number that I have seen. So I think as the states start to reopen the economy, that would help to bring some people back to jobs. But then at the same time, because the duration of the virus and because of, the businesses are not operating at the full capacity, and they have already been on the decline for a while now. So I think it's very likely that some businesses would shed their labor force even more. So I don't think we're out of the woods just yet.
Liang, what is your best estimate on when economies will probably start to get back on track?
This is a great question. I think that's a question that everyone is trying to, find the answer. But as the buzzwords goes, the virus sets the timeline for reopening, but then, the virus also dictates the conditions of opening. We now see a lot of the states start opening their economy. Missouri State, Georgia, Michigan, many of the states are starting to open their economy, but there's still a lot of problems with the supply side disruptions where workers are go back to work. And more importantly, there's a demand side, shock that people are still worried about public health concerns. They're still worried about their jobs and their income. So I think it would still be a long way to go for the markets to sort of stabilize and go back to normality. But we'll start to see, businesses start to reopen, especially in constructions or real estate and manufacturing.
Frank, here in the United States, President Trump has shifted his attention away from the pandemic. He's now focusing on reopening the economy. It's a priority for him. Of course, he's looking down the line at the presidential election, which is coming up in November. But if we look at this, has this pandemic hurt him politically, or will he be seen in the aftermath as some kind of wartime president who steered the ship of state through troubled waters?
Well, it has hurt him in the short term politically. We've seen some shifts in some key demographics. For example, in the very key state of Florida, there's been a very big shift in the support for the president, his approval among older voters, 65 and over. Very dramatic one, actually, if you compare it to the support that he had in 2016. The problem for the president politically is just what you were hearing, really, which is there's so much uncertainty around this. He is betting that he can start to pivot to the opening of the economy. But he's betting against a virus that he cannot control. And if the virus creates a second wave and there needs to be a new round of shutting down, if the second wave creates additional deaths and suffering so that the political backlash is such that, Mr. President, you did this way too soon. And I'm talking about a second wave. We're still in the first wave, as a matter of fact. So he's acting politically out of necessity, but from a public health perspective, desperately, and it's a very high-risk strategy. And he's been very vulnerable to the criticisms for these long briefings that he's held, where at various times he suggested shining a light on your innards, or maybe ingesting some kind of disinfectant, never mind other things. I think looking at it from any realistic perspective on the president's behavior, excuse me, has been erratic, inconsistent, unclear. He is now taking that to another dimension where he's talking more about reopening than public health. It's a very risky strategy, never mind whether it's a legitimate one from just a leadership perspective.
Before the pandemic, Frank, of course, he was touting the economy as one of his strong points in the run-up to the election. Would it be fair to say that even if the economy starts recovering just a little bit, even if the jobless numbers start going in the other direction, that would improve his chances of re-election?
Maybe. Again, we're in such an uncertain world. He's gone from a 3.5% unemployment rate to maybe a 15 or 20 or higher percent unemployment rate. The way he's trying to spin this and set this up to frame it is, wait, we acted decisively. We stopped the travel from China. We could have had 2 million deaths. The number that we've got is still terrible, but it's so far short of that. And the government acted successfully, the federal government. There is almost no measure by which you can say the federal government in the United States has acted decisively and successfully here. That's the problem. And so he's trying to pivot, change the subject, shift the blame. That is a highly, I think, risky, very risky strategy, but that's what he's doing because no other storyline works any better.
Qinduo Xu, China was the first country to be hit by the virus. It has also been the first country to recover from the virus. We know that certain parts of the economy in China are now being reopened. Schools, in fact, in Wuhan, in the city where this started, reopened this week. What can you tell us about the reopening, and are there still restrictions in place?
Yes, basically we call it like the easing of the restrictions. You can see there are basically there were detailed policies at the different locations, different cities, in different parts of China. They are adopting their own different schedule. For example, in Wuhan, probably the latest, you see the students at the, who are to graduate this year, they are coming back to the classes. But if you look at the other parts of China, some provinces, cities, they weren't affected basically or zero infection over the past month or 2 months already. So it's basically completely safe. But of course, people are still using the precautions, wearing a mask and washing their hands as often as in the past. So there's basically it's about the confidence about the population, how confident people are, like to eat out or to meet a friend at the coffee shop. But there are still state level restrictions. For example, during this just past Labor Day holiday, there's 4 days off. 5 days off, consecutive days off. So this is a pretty long holiday. You can see there's more than 100 million people basically visiting different places in the country. Compared to the number of last year, for example, last year is almost 200 million. So it's still, there's increase, of course, from last month, huge increase, but it's still about 60% of last year's number. But it's a gradual process, I would say. And for a lot of scenic sports, there's a limit how many customers you can receive. It's about 1/3 of your capacity to accommodate. So that's a limit set by the government. I think the Chinese government is taking a gradual approach to see if everything will be fine. We are seeing basically people are moving from one part of the country to another part by flying, by train, or driving. So the economy is picking up in general, but it varies from sector to sectors.
Yeah, Liang, I want to talk about trade, especially between the United States and China. President Trump has been talking very tough on China. He's been accusing China of not being transparent enough. He's been saying that this virus originated in a laboratory in Wuhan. But at the same time, we heard on Thursday that trade talks between the United States and China will resume. It will be via telephone, but the United States trade negotiator Robert Lighthizer will lead the US delegation, and the Chinese Vice Premier Liu He will be in on that call as well. So could we put the tough talk down to election rhetoric while we see the real business of trade continuing?
I think the situation will be very difficult at this time. On the one hand, as Frank just talked about, that Trump has been playing all these blaming game to deflect attention on his incompetence to deal with the virus, the pandemic. And on the other hand, just Sunday he has just urged China to fulfill the promise of the phase one trade deal, and said that he's going to terminate the trade deal, if China is not starting to buy that $200 billion of U.S. goods. So I think for any further trade talks, probably the two sides would have to think of a way to somehow implement the phase one trade deal. The difficulty, of course, on the one hand is, China's economy is just return to sort of some normalcy at the very underutilized capacity. So oil consumption, oil imports, and energy imports are still going to be pretty low for at least quite a while. So it would be difficult from China's demand side to ratchet up to that $200 billion in 2 years purchase agreement. But more importantly, I think the supply side disruption in the United States will make it very difficult for China to import from the US. Take meat production or poultry production, for example. The US now is facing supply chain disruption in a lot of these meat industries. And President Trump has to enact the National Defense Act to make sure that these companies are open, the factories are open. So it makes no sense whatsoever. On the one hand, you're telling Americans that you can only get 3 bags of meat at once from Costco, and yet at the same time, sending the meat and the poultry to China. That is way too altruistic for President Trump.
Nan, could I jump in here? I think this is going to be so fascinating and difficult to watch, because the pressures are going to ratchet up and up, even as these two countries need one another more and more. China needs the markets. China can be an engine, an economic engine, if it's starting back up again, when the world has very few of those, and the United States needs those. American companies need to do business in China. On the other hand, they've been burned by doing business in China. The president wants to start these trade talks at the same time as he is increasingly trying to blame China for a variety of problems, both to deflect the tension from himself and to project himself with some degree of strength, in his view, into an election campaign. So these two countries very much need, and one other thing, by the way, they're both racing to find a vaccine for this virus. And there should be cooperation there. And then if one side finds it, there's going to need to be efforts to replicate in some kind of trustworthy way and then distribute a virus. So the crosswinds and the pressures are immense, and the signals from both countries of hostility toward the other increase, even as they try to do this. So it's frankly a mess right now.
Okay, at that point we are going to take a break. We'll be back with our panel right after that. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.
In a world that's constantly moving, what is it that really defines us? Is it the ideas of our time or the trends that shape our lives? Full Frame, weekly on CGTN America.
Whether it's about your education, the home you live in, or the items you buy, your money has a story to tell, because every business story is a human story. Global Business.
Welcome back to The Heat. We're talking about the challenges posed around the world by COVID-19. Let's get back to our panel right now. And Qinduo Xu, let me start with you. The Trump administration is considering imposing some kinds of economic sanctions or penalties on China. And there's been talk of the United States not paying back the loans that it has taken from China. Those loans in the form of US Treasury bonds. China, of course, could retaliate by lessening its holdings on those bonds. I mean, in this kind of war, could there be any winners?
Well, no, unfortunately. This is, as people said, this is a nuclear option. We don't know whether the Trump administration will, move toward this direction, because this is really too destructive to even talk about that. And the reality that, the Trump administration, his officials, they talked about this option itself is shocking to a lot of people. Because for the US, it's really about the credibility. If you once even talk about that, then in particular, if you choose that path, that means you can do this not only to China, but also to other countries, because we know that the US government is now following this America First principle. They don't care about whether you are ally or as long as you are another country, as long as it's in our interest, we could choose a really destructive path. For China, of course, China will suffer from that. But the thing is, China will probably, there's a more strong, I would say, motive for China to shift its reserve in other currencies, for example, the Japanese yen or the euro, or, to develop more quickly about its digital currency to reduce its reliance on the US dollar. Not only China, but also other countries have this such a growing motive to do that. For example, Russia, Iran, possibly other important economies in the future, if the US choose to do so.
Liang, just before the break, you were saying something, and actually I want to talk about the essay that you wrote. You wrote that many Americans believe that COVID-19 revealed the danger of relying on China for manufactured products, but you also warned against what you called economic nationalism. You say that is not only unfeasible, it's also undesirable. What do you mean by that? Explain that to us.
Well, first of all, I think it's invisible because, US and China are the two largest economies in the world. It would be very difficult for the two countries to disentangle after they have been, having trade integrations and a lot of economic cooperations, investments, and so on for decades. It would be very difficult for them to sort of disentangle. And China offers not just a cheap labor, as many people would believe, which is very easy to sort of find alternatives. China offers also, 207 million, migrant workers. They're very flexible and they're also very, technically trained than many other countries' labor. And China also has the integrated infrastructure that ensures logistic efficiency. And last but not least, China has built its own, supply chain within the country and has a lot of sort of industrial clustering that other countries cannot replicate. And it's also very undesirable in the sense that, economic nationalism, it's very costly. And now that we're thinking about, post-pandemic recovery of the economy, countries need to increase their efficiency. They need to find ways to explore new markets. So I think, trying to close the door would be very disruptive for that recovery process. I wanted to also quickly go back to Qinduo's point. We have to remember that only 32% of that 24 trillion US treasuries are held abroad, which means if the US renege on China's holding, what this would do is it will send the interest rate up and send the bond value down, which means a lot of the bond holders in the United States, pension funds, hedge funds, mutual funds, they would also see the losses on their portfolio. So I think, this would definitely be a big loss for the United States if they go that route. The other option the US have been talking about is to increase tariffs, but let's not forget the tariffs are paid by US businesses and consumers. If Trump cannot get Mexico to pay for the war, I don't think there was any way for him to make China pay for that reparation. And there's no legal basis, there's no historical precedence for this either, right? We don't ask Spain to pay for, the Spanish flu. We didn't ask Mexico to pay for the H1N1. So it makes no sense just to blame the victim.
Well, and if I could just say, two things that you just raised that are really important. If this economy, the United States, the world economy is going to get restarted, it needs both the confidence and the cash for consumers to go be doing business. Raising tariffs in the middle of an environment like that is very dangerous. Meanwhile, the United States government is going trillions of dollars into debt to try to fund efforts to stabilize the economy. That becomes a precarious time to rattle the credit markets and rattle bondholders, because you need to be able to fund the debt. You need to be able to find, people who will buy your debt, and you need confidence in the economy for that. So again, very, very treacherous thin ice here.
Frank, if we also listen to some of the language coming from the United States, we've heard these conspiracy theories, as we talked a few minutes ago, about this virus being developed in a laboratory in Wuhan, that it escaped from that laboratory. But it's coming from the highest levels of the US government. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has been talking about that. He has walked that back a bit. But that's led some commentators, some very respected commentators here in the United States, to talk of a new Cold War with China. And I'm wondering, how risky is that? Is this completely uncharted waters that we're getting into here?
We are in uncharted waters. I mean, the crisis creates an uncharted territory by itself. Then you have the political cycle, which is completely predictable, but adds to the complexity. And then you have the personality of Donald Trump and the kind of campaign that he and his people have already said they are going to run. They've already said they will demonize Joe Biden for his connections to China. So, this is a live wire. I don't think it's completely unpredictable. The United States is not the only place that is generating conspiracy theories. China has been doing that as well. Situations like this, scholars look at this in the area of disinformation. This is the absolute most fertile soil for conspiracy theories. Large, sudden crises that take place, they appear to be inexplicable. Massive numbers of people are on the receiving end. You have a white-hot social media and media environment where these rumors can spread. And so what we have heard will by no means be the last of the conspiracy theories. There's a lot of activity at our university and other places to figure out how to counter disinformation and these conspiracy theories, but they will continue to prosper, I'm afraid. And they often serve the interests of national leaders and other leaders well, because they allow autocrats or Democrats to shift the attention from their own responsibility to this kind of murky unknown. And so I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of this, I'm afraid.
Qinduo, what's the view from Beijing? When Beijing listens to these allegations coming out of the United States, how does it respond?
Well, the spokesperson of the Chinese Foreign Ministry has asked at least twice for evidence. If Secretary of State Pompeo said, as he said, he has seen significant amount of evidence to show that the virus is from a lab in Wuhan. And then probably he's expected to share the evidence with the rest of the world to show that he's right. But despite the fact that most of the scientists and researchers disagree with him, including his, the U.S. intelligence community disagreeing with him. So obviously, I think my point of view is that's obviously a conspiracy theory, and I'm not sure why the U.S. government is sticking to that that direction. It's China should be blamed. In terms of handling of this crisis at the beginning, initial stage, there are major steps as in China, as in other governments, because no government is prepared for something we see once in 100 years. So in a sense, that's understandable. You have no idea what kind of virus that is, how contagious it is, whether it is contagious from person to person. But to say that China somehow, intentionally or accidentally release this virus from a particular lab, and you have to show the evidence. Otherwise, I think the US will be in a very embarrassing situation here.
All right, I want to move back to Yan Liang. Yan Liang, I want to get back to that essay that you wrote. It was a great essay, and you wrote about global crises there, like this pandemic or even climate change, which is coming down the road. And you say that it requires cooperation, it requires coordination. We need to pool our resources. We need to share our knowledge as well. But if you look at what's happening right now, the United States has adopted this policy of America first. We look at the idea of multilateralism. How much of a setback is all this for that concept?
Well, it's great setback. I think, when Frank was talking about the US-China Cold War, what really sort of chills me is not how this not only affects US-China, but some of the most vulnerable population in the world. I'm referring to, sort of the developing nations in the emerging markets. They're much less powerful and have much less capacity to withhold any, public health crises and economic crises that followed. We're talking about the estimate of 130 million people who can go into famine in the year of 2020 and beyond. And so I think a lot of developing countries are in face of, not only just health crises, but also debt crises. The G20 just granted the moratorium on 67 the poorest countries to relieve and extend their debt. But countries like Argentina, Brazil, and also advanced countries like Italy and Spain, they're all scrambling, trying to find solutions to their debt problems. So I think we have a lot more, crises down the road, and it makes no sense whatsoever for the two most powerful and most economically affluent countries to be engaged in this very destructive Cold War instead of helping, other countries and also helping the world. So I think, yes, that would be a big setback.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. It's been a great discussion. Thanks to all of you for being with us. You've been watching The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu. Thanks for being with us.
This is a show for people who love exploring, discovering, and experiencing life stories. A diverse, rich, and beautiful land. Latin America is not only about poverty or crime or riots. We want to set the record straight with in-depth reporting and compelling stories, like the UN leaving Haiti, the reinvention of Cuba, and the peace treaty in Colombia. We'll introduce you to extraordinary people, like this woman in Bolivia taking back their heritage and independence. A fantastic 14-year-old who created a bank to help kids, keeping them off the streets. Entrepreneurs who are making a real difference every day. This is truly nature's paradise. We'll take you to the biggest rainforest in the world, the driest desert, the Andes Mountains, the blue water of the Caribbean, the Galapagos Islands, Patagonia, Easter Island, fantastic places that are only in Latin America. Watch America's Now. You'll get a better understanding of our world, our current times, and our human spirit. America's Now, only on CGTN.
Again, he can hold in guns. Machine guns from police forces toward the protesters.
Were you worried about your life at that particular time?
Not at all.
Thank you very much for your time. What is your assessment of the state of the continent today?
Africa has the potential to power itself.
Excuse me.